the idea is right and the idea is good. The challenges arise in the implementation of it.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our series. We're going to be talking a little bit about data democratization, which is something that we've been asked about quite a bit. So with us today, we actually have a friend and one of my mentors, Erik Heller, who I've been working with for a long time and knows a lot about market research. Erik, how you going?
Very well, very well. Thanks for having me.
No, not a problem at all. And with me as well, we have our lovely co-host, Marina Khan. Marina, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
That's good. So, guys, what we wanted to chat about today is data democratization and kind of just generally what it is and why it seems to be sweeping up the data world in particular by storm, and why it's kind of particularly important given the kind of AI systems that we're in at the moment, as well as the fact that everyone seems to want to have access to data, but there may not necessarily be the skill sets out there.
Look, I think I'm not entirely sure if there is one single definition in practice. I think in theory the idea is very much that rather than continuing with the status quo, there is a movement to making data more available in organizations and allowing more people more access to the data that exists to help them make better decisions and take better actions and create a better working world. If that's the theory, and it rests, the theory rests quite heavily on both access but also skills. So it's and arguably the skills also stretch into ethics and those types of things. So not just having access to the data, but also knowing how to use the data and how to use it in the right way. Some people, approach it in that holistic sense. Others kind of pick and choose. They kind of sort of own path in that, and often it comes back to access only. The sort of skills fall a little bit by the wayside, and this is, I think, when it then can create challenges, and as a result of those challenges, a bit of a backlash to the movement.
Marina, you've done a lot of work in the community space as well. So I guess what are your thoughts on this topic and kind of your background as well?
As long as it's done in a positive way and in a way that makes sense to people for different parts of an organization or a community to access data, it is probably good, and it has value. It has sort of benefits. I guess my experience more recently is kind of stemming, or I'm thinking a little bit more about the idea of research democratize. I mean, it's particularly to Erik's point as well, and Erik, your role as the idea of research democratization, which kind of sort of flows on from that idea of data democratization. Traditionally, research has been done by CX and UXR teams to kind of then go in and provide insights to product teams and engineering teams so that they can make decisions, and also marketing teams so that they can make marketing decisions. Now, there's this kind of trend from this idea of data democratization to democratize research as well, which is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently. And that basically means that, allowing or enabling access in these different teams to then conduct research as and when they see fit, and use the data as and when they see fit to inform decisions. I just want to, I guess, ask you, what is your take on that? What are your thoughts on that? And can that be done effectively?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think my thoughts on it are, very similar to what I said earlier in terms of the entire concept, right? Like it's the idea is right and the idea is good. The challenges arise in the implementation of it, there are perhaps some parallels to other aspects of society, like the news, for instance, that we see. Like for every news article that you read that argues one thing, you'll see another that argues the opposite, and both generally tend to cite data, often even data that comes from the same source. it's just, like a quarter turn one way or a quarter turn the other way to support a particular argument. Of course, that there is often no one right answer in many of the things that we look at. What there is often, though, maybe not one right way of doing the research or using the data, but there's definitely wrong ways of using data and doing research. So, and I think therein lies a risk. Like if someone wants to use data or research to prove a certain point, and someone else wants to use it to prove a different point or an opposite point, in my opinion, that's still an appropriate use of data and research, even though I might not agree with one or the other of those viewpoints or the end outcomes. I think the bigger problem is when people either deliberately or through lack of skill, pretend data or research is evidence for a particular action or conclusion, when in fact it's not.
What I feel is that if you are a data specialist or a research specialist, your job is to be impartial because data is so easy to misinterpret. And that's where I feel, this idea of democratization of data, although it's good in principle, and I'm not saying that I would suggest ever to companies or to practitioners that they shouldn't be trying to increase access to data. But what I'd say is if you're a product designer, for example, and you've spent, say, 6 months designing an MVP, and then you have to go out and prove that it's going to have traction in the market, you have a very specific agenda that is, I need this to work. And so you're going to try and collect data and collect information that backs up that agenda just by the nature of human psychology.
Well, I think it goes to the skills component, right? Not just the skills component, and I talked about or touched on ethics earlier, right? Like, which is the skills are not just the practical skills, but they involve skills as well of like approaching it in the right way, in the right spirit, and like whether the human psyche can ever entirely separate those two issues is probably a separate question, perhaps too big for our chat today. But I think the concept of data democratization will always, like democracy itself, one might argue, have some risks. Like that. Like you're not always going to get exactly what you want, but there is an open and fair exchange of ideas, and with the right kind of guardrails, which I think that the sort of conundrum that you've pointed out, Chris, is it falls into that. Like, are the guardrails actually being followed? If people are doing self-serving things to prove other things. Like, I think data democratization doesn't necessarily eradicate the principle of independent evaluation. It just means that data isn't kept in an ivory tower, if you know what I mean. That it just doesn't make it a free for all for anyone, and to play. You still have to have the right skills, and those trusting your data would need to have confidence that it's done in the right way, but also with the right sort of governance and ethical underpinning, if you will.
Does our role evolve then? Does it change? Do we become more of, data evangelists, or some kind of, like, or even more like coaches, or to kind of provide those guardrails and provide those kinds of ethical underpinnings that need to undergo with data?
I really like that question, because I was going to say there are the tenets that were put forward by, I think it was Samara Singh and a couple of years ago, where they kind of talked about, broadening access to users, promoting data sharing, and having a culture of willingness to share and then accept the diversity of skill sets that would then enhance the quality of data. I think it's important what you're saying, because if you think about data and research, there's generally two fundamental skill sets or probably three actually, that have traditionally fed into those disciplines. You've got the data scientist, who is responsible for manipulating the data and producing insights from it. You've got data architects, who generally are programmers and people that have very good coding skills, and then you generally have kind of like a governance position, which might be a CIO or a CTO, and none of those positions have specialty in either ethics or legality. And I think a big chunk of the modern data world, so much of how you use data is fundamentally underpinned by what is ethical, but then also what is actually legal to do. So if what's being asked of data specialists or research specialists is to now become these evangelists, actually, are they getting the skill sets needed to be able to actually have those conversations and actually take on almost that governance level role? I don't know. I mean, Erik, have you got any experience, industry bodies talking about this?
Yeah, look, I think so. I mean, most of the time that debate really happens in the privacy space, and like there's a big concern about personal data being, well, not just used, but even collected in the first place, and so forth, and problems that arise from that, which is slightly separate of what we're talking about here. But I think the industry and practitioners in general have a role to play in helping make this almost inevitable trend unfold and develop in a way that will ultimately help realize the benefits that undoubtedly are there, but do so with what in a way that mitigates some of the risks.
But I guess on the other hand, there is this argument of more effective knowledge translation, and so there's this big push to do a lot of science communication at the moment, do a lot of research communication at the moment, and so there's that. So there are two, I guess, aspects to it. There's one that obviously the guardrails that are there, but then there's also okay, how can we then make this information more digestible and more accessible to more and more people?
Can I add to that as well, just an overlay of also, Erik, coming from and being a practitioner, is it realistic that industry would be able to actually apply those level of kind of constitutional safeguards to data democratization?
In the main, when we really talk about data democratization currently, it's within an organization, or it is within government and interagency data sharing and so forth, right? Like, it's not just out there. It's not like someone puts it on a website and anyone can go and get the data. Like, that's not where we are, and with respect to a lot of data, probably will never be there, because it's just not appropriate for organizations to share their internal data. So when we're really having a tangible rather than a philosophical conversation about data democratization, it really happens within an organization, or perhaps a government department or a government overall, and then it is absolutely possible to kind of set the right sort of governance structures and guardrails and so forth. Often that's done by some way of access restriction in practical terms. That there's often an ambition or a vision to educate and so forth, but often what we see in practice is we don't share the raw data right?
Yeah.
We share dashboards, or and
Yeah.
lots of
So
names for those.
let's talk about that, because I want to just change the direction of the conversation a little bit, but I think it is very relevant to what you've actually just said, which is one of the things that has over the last kind of 5 years in this area been spoken about a lot is how to make the data more accessible, more easily, more freely. And one of the key tools that has been spoken about quite a bit is enterprise marketplaces, where you basically, let's say that you work at a major media company. There's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of studies or data programs being done within that organization at any given moment. And rather than giving people access to the data like used to be the case when people would have data warehouses, we've now moved to data lakes, which have different structured data. It can be from PDFs that have got pictures and infographics all the way through to hardcore kind of data, almost dashboards and things like that. Now, one of the things that's happening that is disrupting this, and I imagine it's going to become even more of a trend over the next 5 years, is all of a sudden AI programs like ChatGPT, a lot of companies are now starting to in-house those programs themselves, and they're starting to use their own data to power those. And I wonder, we've obviously spoken about some of the risks associated with this, but let's talk about it specifically in this case, because it now gives people not only the ability to access data almost freely, but it also allows them to access data and have it restructured in near real time by a computer that may not fully understand the data that it's actually interacting with. It's just restructuring according to a series of very complex algorithms. And I wonder, across the three of us, what we think about this and what we believe might be the risks attached to it.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, right? Like, and I mean, at the risk of being slightly controversial here, like I think the AI might actually be the salvation in this rather than an additional risk, right? In the sense that the complexity and sort of variety of data that organizations hold these days, let alone multiple organizations and society as a whole, right? It will be very challenging for individuals or even, sort of ad hoc smaller kind of teams to have all of the necessary skills to actually tackle that data, right? And when we're talking about data democratization, we're essentially saying, like, Chris, you have access to all of the data that your organization holds. Marina, you have all the access to all the data your organization holds. Now, it is more realistic, maybe not in the present day, but in the future, to train AI to interact with that data in that right way, and potentially, not do certain things. You can actually build ethics into the AI if it's a closed AI, right? In a closed environment, than it is to do that for every employee in an organization. In a workforce, quite frankly, where in most organizations there's a 20% churn a year on year, right? So it's in many ways it can be the solution.
And I was wondering whether we miss some of the nuance. I mean, as a qualitative researcher, I think a lot of my it's almost the experiences, the outlier experience is what we're kind of often talking about, and often, just to add depth and nuance and to tell a bit more of that sort of human story. And I wonder, I guess I'm still sort of very divided on this conversation, because I wonder whether that nuance tends to get missed. I guess the word I would use is cautious optimism. That to think about, when I come to think about qualitative insights and like the nuance that qualitative research tends to add.
That said, I do wonder, there was a conversation several years ago when Elon Musk was first talking about self-driving cars, and they were, people were talking about the fact that there's been accidents. And one of the stats that got put out, I can't remember what the numbers were, but it was like, if a self-driving car has 99 out of 100 trips are safe, and then one where there is an incident, and then maybe 1 in 1,000 of them have an accident. Humans have, say, a 98% accuracy. And so it's actually humans have twice the level of error attached to them that the AI does, but we just inherently don't trust the machines that are doing this stuff for us. So I actually wonder, you're absolutely right in talking about there might be some nuance mix, but I wonder whether the missed nuance will actually be greater or less than would from an everyday person doing their own research, which in particular in the qualitative space, the world is rife with people running their own interviews and not doing them well. So I don't know. I mean, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I guess I want to say one thing about that, and that is that the GPT or the current sort of AI models that we know that are being used to even produce synthetic users or synthetic humans or whatever the research sort of is largely trained on Western data models. And so if we are doing cultural research, for instance, which is my background, and if we are working with sort of minority audiences, for instance, I guess, is there maybe that's somewhere that kind of really plays a role, and we really need to think about that. What are your thoughts, Erik?
Yeah, look, I think when it comes to AI, I'm conscious we're talking a lot about AI, and that's not the topic of this podcast, but it's it needs to be fit for purpose. There is no one AI. There are some AI algorithms and you call it providers, if you will, that have risen to prominence recently, to help people familiarize themselves with it, and further the ongoing debate and development of the technology. But if you deployed AI as it is today in any context, it's always going to be risky, right? Because it is, as you say, it's trained on Western data. Like most of the AI that's accessible to the everyday person today is trained on data that's 3 years out of date. It doesn't even know COVID. It might know COVID, but there isn't. It really depends on what you are looking at, there is a risk in that, right? Because people will not necessarily appreciate that and appreciate the importance of context in it, right? And I think there are undoubtedly things that at this point, things that humans will pick up and not miss that AI will miss. Very similar to self-driving cars, right? Like there was an article on the weekend, I don't know if you read it. It's about the issues they're having in San Francisco, where they've been rolling out self-driving cars, taxis, and one drove into wet cement. And there was signs there, wet cement, and it just wasn't in the algorithm. Didn't know it, so it just drove straight in. Like a human, would have. Just a human mind would have appreciated that context and would have made a different decision. But to Chris's point, I think there are also, and we were talking about qualitative research before, there are either things that humans would miss in qualitative research, or that humans would latch on to when really they shouldn't. And outliers are interesting if they're treated as such, but I think we all know that what can often happen is outliers become the main story because they're interesting and people latch on to that. And the fact that 98 or 99% of people didn't have that experience at all, then leads you down the wrong path. It might make a good story, but it might make it lead to a good decision.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think fundamentally to all of this as well is that if you're using data and you're navigating with data, making sure that it's done in a way that is going to be it's going to work and is going to be able to be communicated across the organization to achieve some sort of outcome. And a key part of that is storytelling, which is something we're going to talk about next week with a different particular guest. So on that note, I might end this one here, and thank you, Erik, for taking the time out today to chat to us, and we'll be seeing you all again soon.
Fabulous. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed the chat.